Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm Joe Firestone, your host. I'm afraid I made a little bit of a mistake in my topic for tonight. I named the stream, I named it Eye to Eye. I should have named it Eyeball to Eyeball, as in NATO and Russia. Are they eyeball to eyeball? Well, we shall see. Somebody has arrived. They have not announced themselves, but I'm going to get right into it. A piece appeared in Common Dreams called Putin Warns of, quote, serious consequences if Ukraine uses Western arms, okay, in Russia. The title doesn't tell the full story, but the photo above it is Russian President Vladimir Putin gestures while speaking at the Kremlin in Moscow on May 29th, 2024. Before he talked in Moscow, though, he talked in Tashkent, okay, in Uzbekistan, during a news conference where he also warned of serious consequences. The Russian president condemned the West's, quote, constant escalation as NATO members, including France, Germany, and Canada, backed Kyiv's use of long-range missiles to attack targets inside his country. Well, they're only relatively long-range. They're not intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're not even intermediate range ballistic missiles. They're longer range, short-range missiles. Anyway, this piece is by Brett Wilkins, May 29, 2024. As the head of NATO and leaders of NATO member nations join the United States in advocating Ukrainian use of Western-supplied weapons to strike inside Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned Tuesday that any such attacks could have grave repercussions. Quote, this constant escalation can lead to serious consequences, unquote. Quote, Putin told reporters to a visit to Uzbekistan, specifically the historic city of Tashkent. Quote, if these serious consequences occur in Europe, how will the United States behave, bearing in mind our parity in the field of strategic weapons? It's hard to say. Do they want a global conflict, unquote, asked the Russian president. Putin's remarks came after French President Emmanuel Macron said Ukraine should be allowed to, quote, neutralize, unquote, bases inside Russia from which Russian forces are launching missiles at Ukrainian targets. Quote, we should not allow them to touch other targets in Russia and obviously civilian capacities, unquote, Macron said during a visit to Germany. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who has so far declined to approve the transfer of his country's Taurus long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine, said he agreed with Macron so long as Kyiv adheres to any restrictions imposed by suppliers. That was an ambiguous reply because we don't know what the restrictions could be, of course. I also need to add to this comment that the Taurus long-range cruise missiles have a range of 400 miles, so they're only relatively long range. The intermediate range ballistic missiles have ranges of, I don't know, 1,500 to maybe 2,500 miles, something like that. So you can see, relatively speaking, these are not really long range, but they're much longer range than the attacker missiles are, which are much more like 200-mile missiles, 250-mile missiles. So the point is they can reach more deeply into Russia. Uh, of course, he has so far declined to approve the transfer of the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Quote, Ukraine has every possibility under international law for what it is doing. That has to be said explicitly, unquote, Scholz said during a joint press conference with Macron. Quote, I find it strange when some people argue that it should not be allowed to defend itself and take measures that is suitable uh, before this. Well, I guess I got a comment on this, and that is, okay, if Ukraine were using their own missiles manufactured domestically inside, okay, of Ukraine, and were using those to fight their war with Russia, uh, I'm sure that most people would not object, as dangerous as it might be. But that is not the present situation, as we all know. To get more deeply into the present situation, let us go further. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, or Jens Stoltenberg, said Tuesday that he also supports letting Ukrainian forces use Western supplied arms to attack Russia, which launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Quote, the time has come to consider whether it will be right to lift some of the restrictions which have been imposed, because we see now that, especially in the Kharkiv region, the front line and the border line is more or less the same, he asserted. The United Kingdom, Canada, Poland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, the Czech Republic, and other NATO members also say Ukraine should be permitted to attack targets inside Russia. In the United States, NATO's most powerful member, there is disagreement within the Biden administration over the policy. While Secretary of State Antony Blinken is reportedly pushing for a change in the administration's stance against the use of U.S. supplied weapons to attack Russian soil, National Security spokesman John Kirby told reporters Tuesday that quote, there is no change to our policy at this point. Also, there was a video today of Antony Blinken uh, uh, um, actually stating that once weapons are transferred to Ukraine, that it's up to them as to whether they want to use those weapons to attack deep into Russia, or words to that effect. Uh, but Kirby said, we don't encourage, quote, we don't encourage or enable the use of U.S. supplied weapons to strike uh, 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 inside of Russia. Blinken, speaking in Moldova on Wednesday, ahead of NATO talks in Prague, the Czech Republic, responded to a question about whether the United States would support Ukrainian use of Western supplied arms to attack Russia by saying that, quote, we're always listening, we're always learning, and we're always making determinations about what's necessary to make sure that Ukraine can effectively continue to defend itself, unquote. Quote again, at every step along the way, we've adapted and adjusted as necessary, unquote, he added. Quote again, and so that's exactly what we'll be doing going forward, unquote. Police in Chisinau, Moldova's capital, violently arrested anti-war demonstrators protesting Blinken's visit. Protesters reportedly doused American flags in beetroot juice simulating blood, and chanted messages including, quote, blink and go home, we don't want war, unquote, and, quote again, we don't need NATO. So here we are, some of the citizens, okay, of Moldova, stated that. So that's the controversy. Do the suppliers of weapons allow the Ukrainians to attack, okay, inside, okay, of Russia? We'll get more deeply into that question as we go forward here tonight. Going to our second piece. This is a rather great piece, if I can find it among all those I have open. It's an opinion piece, appeared also in Common Dreams, by Jeffrey Sachs. In my view, the man who should be the Secretary of State of the United States at this time and going forward. Here's a picture of participants in the Easter March at Bochel Air Base, Kochern-Zell district in Germany, walking along the outer fence of the military facility where U.S. nuclear weapons are said to be stored on April 1st, 2024. The banner reads, "Give peace a chance." It's a Greenpeace banner, by the way. And the photo was by Thomas Frey, DPA. Photo by Thomas Frey, Picture Alliance via Getty Images. The article was written by Jeffrey D. Sachs, as I indicated, the Columbia professor and director of the Center for Sustainability there. Presidents who gamble with nuclear Armageddon is the title of the piece. Each of the last 5 presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, have brought us closer to the brink. We desperately need leaders with a knack for peace who can steer the nation and the world toward a more secure and less dangerous future, says Jeff Sachs. This was as of May 29th, 2024, or yesterday. The overriding job of any U.S. president is to keep the nation safe. In the nuclear age, that mainly means avoiding nuclear Armageddon. Joe Biden's reckless and incompetent foreign policy is pushing us closer to annihilation. He joins a long and undistinguished list of presidents who have gambled with Armageddon, including his immediate predecessor and rival, Donald Trump. Talk of nuclear war is currently everywhere. Leaders of NATO countries call for Russia's defeat and even dismemberment, while telling us not to worry about Russia's 6,000 nuclear warheads. Ukraine uses NATO's supplied missiles to knock out parts of Russia's nuclear attack early warning system inside of Russia. In other words, one of those missiles, the longer range missiles we sent over to Ukraine, was used to knock out parts of Russia's nuclear attack early warning system. Is that provocative? Does that represent an existential threat to Russia? I would say it's getting there. Those were the early warning radars, the over-horizon radars. Very important for Russian defense against a nuclear attack. Is Putin going to tolerate that? I don't know. But Russia, in the meantime, engages in nuclear drills near its border with Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg give the green light to Ukraine to use NATO weapons to hit Russian territory as an increasingly desperate and extremist Ukrainian regime sees fit. These leaders neglect, at our greatest peril, the most basic lesson of the nuclear confrontation between the U.S. and Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as told by President John F. Kennedy, one of the few American presidents in the nuclear age to take our survival seriously. In the aftermath of the crisis, Kennedy told us and his successors, quote, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. Yet this is exactly what Biden is doing today, carrying out a bankrupt and reckless policy. Nuclear war can easily arise from an escalation of non-nuclear war or by a hothead leader with access to nuclear arms deciding on a surprise first strike or by a gross miscalculation. The last of these nearly occurred even after Kennedy and his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, had already negotiated an end to the Cuban Missile Crisis when a disabled Soviet submarine came within a hair's breadth of launching a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Most presidents and most Americans have little idea how close to the abyss we are. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was founded in 1947, in part to help the world avoid nuclear annihilation, established the doomsday clock to help the public understand the gravity of the risks we face. National security experts adjust the clock depending how far or how close we are to midnight, quote unquote, meaning extinction. They put the clock today at just 90 seconds to midnight, the closest, excuse me, than it's ever been in the nuclear age. The clock is a useful measure of which presidents have, quote, gotten it, unquote, and which have not. The sad fact is that most presidents have recklessly gambled with our survival in the name of national honor, or to prove their personal toughness, or to avoid political attacks from the warmongers, or as a result of sheer incompetence. By a simple and straightforward count, 5 presidents have gotten it right, moving the clock away from midnight, while 9 have moved us closer to Armageddon, including the most recent 5 presidents. Truman was president when the doomsday clock was unveiled in 1947 at 7 minutes to midnight. Truman stoked the nuclear arms race and left office with a clock at just 3 minutes to midnight. Eisenhower continued the arms race, but also entered into the first ever negotiations with the Soviet Union regarding nuclear disarmament. By the time he left office, the clock was put back to 7 minutes to midnight. Kennedy saved the world by coolly reasoning his way through the Cuban Missile Crisis, rather than following the advice of hothead advisors who called for war. For a detailed account, see Martin Sherwin's Magisterial Gambling with Armageddon, 2020. He then uh, negotiated the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with Khrushchev in 1963. By the time of his death, which may well have been a government coup resulting from Kennedy's peace initiative, JFK had pushed the clock back to 12 minutes to midnight, a magnificent and historic achievement. It was not to last. Lyndon Johnson soon escalated in Vietnam and pushed the clock back again to just 7 minutes to midnight. Richard Nixon eased tensions with both the Soviet Union and China and concluded the strategic arms limitation treaty, SALT I, pushing the clock again to 12 minutes from midnight. Yet Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter failed to secure SALT II, and Carter faithfully and unwisely gave a green light to the CIA in 1979 to destabilize Afghanistan. By the time Ronald Reagan took office, the clock was at just 4 minutes to midnight. Now, the next 12 years marked the end of the Cold War. Much of the credit is due to Mikhail Gorbachev, who aimed to reform the Soviet Union politically and economically and to end the confrontation with the West. Yet credit is also due to Reagan and his successor, George Bush Sr., who successfully worked with Gorbachev to end the Cold War, which in turn was followed by the end of the Soviet Union itself in December 1991. By the time Bush left office, the doomsday clock was at 17 minutes to midnight, the safest since the start of the nuclear age. Sadly, the U.S. security establishment could not take, quote, yes, unquote, for an answer when Russia said an emphatic yes to peaceful and cooperative relations. But the U.S. needed to, quote, win, unquote, the Cold War, not just end it. It needed to declare itself and prove itself to be the sole superpower of the world, the one that would unilaterally write the rules of a new U.S.-led, quote, rules-based order, unquote. The post-1992 U.S. therefore launched wars and expanded its vast network of military bases as it saw fit, steadfastly and ostentatiously ignoring the red lines of other nations, indeed aiming to drive nuclear adversaries into humiliating retreats. Since 1972, every president has left the U.S. and the world closer to nuclear annihilation than its predecessor. The doomsday clock was at 17 minutes to midnight when Clinton came to office, but just 9 minutes when he left it. He cut 8 minutes off that clock. Bush, that is Bush 43, pushed the clock to just 5 minutes. Obama to 3 minutes, and Trump to a mere 100 seconds. Now Biden has taken the clock to 90 seconds. I'm surprised that it's only 10 seconds off Trump. Okay, it seems to me that by pushing Russia into starting the Ukraine war, that Biden took a lot more seconds off that than Trump did, and it's doubtful that Trump would have done the pushing that Biden did, in my view. Biden has led the U.S. into 3 fulminant crises, any one of which could end up in Armageddon. By insisting on NATO enlargement to Ukraine against Russia's bright red line, Biden has repeatedly pushed for Russia's humiliating retreat. By siding with the genocidal Israel, he has stoked a new Middle East arms race and a dangerously expanding Middle East conflict. By taunting China over Taiwan, which the U.S. ostensibly recognizes as part of one China, he is inviting a war with China. Trump similarly stirred the nuclear pot on several fronts, most flagrantly with China and Iran. Washington seems of a single mind these days. More funding for wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and more arms for Taiwan. We slouch ever closer to Armageddon. Polls show the American people overwhelmingly disapprove of U.S. foreign policy, but their opinion accounts for very little. We need to shout for peace from every hilltop. The survival of our children and grandchildren depends on it. I could not agree more. And by the way, I've forgotten to share this to Facebook. So let me do that now. By the way, I should say that my stream of last night was taken down by Facebook for violating community standards. Of course, that's so vague that most of us do not know what violating community standards actually means. That's never happened to me before. I don't know which standard I have, violated. I asked for a review because of the importance of the issues discussed in last night's stream, but I thought I ought to inform you about what is happening. In any case, if these actions continue, then I may be leaving Facebook and restricting myself to YouTube and Twitter, and I may decide to go to Rumble as a third choice to stream to. So I guess I need to say that to you. I find Facebook's action in this case to be completely unreasonable. So there we have it. So far, of course, we have the problem, which is the immediate problem of allowing Ukraine to hit key strategic targets deep inside of Russia with missiles we sell to them. But the problem is actually more serious than that, because we're not simply selling them the missiles and that's it, as we'll go into further, as we go through the next two entries in what I want to share with you. The first of those entries
this is just before.
What I'm sharing with you now is an interview that Nima Alkershin had with Pepe Escobar, a couple of days ago. It was an illuminating interview, in many ways. The subject of the interview, the title of it is Putin and Xi's move to checkmate NATO. And I'm just going to go through this with you. I'll skip around here.
What do you skip?
the Suez Canal, which is essentially controlled by the Americans, essentially. So this is a graphic example of how the whole pattern of international trade.
Okay, let's go back to here.
This was the embryo of what the Chinese later on developed as the New Silk Road, which, if we look only at Eurasia, would be a free trade zone between Shanghai and Xi'an all the way to Madrid. It's exactly the same thing. And of course, from a Chinese point of view, because they have the geoeconomic firepower and those enormous funds, Africa, Eurasia, and Latin America, Eurasia as well. So it's nearly global. The new the
What he's talking about is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also the Belt and Road Initiative. Those two initiatives of China working very closely with Russia, especially in recent years, and the strategic and geopolitical significance of those efforts.
new Silk Roads encompass at least 80% of the planet. And the Russians, a few years later, after 2013, the New Silk Roads, they came up with the concept of a Greater Eurasia Partnership, which is an official concept in Russia. And one of the conceptualizers was Sergei Karaganov. I had the pleasure to talk to Karaganov at his office in late 2018 in Moscow. And these were the finishing touches of a Greater Eurasia Partnership, where it was about to be officially not green lighted, but the Kremlin would start referring to it directly as official Russian policy. So it's essentially the same thing. Eurasia Partnership and the Silk Roads is a geoeconomic integration, trade, and commerce that is also geopolitical because it changes the system that is always geared towards the lines of communication and the channels of communication and the maritime channels of communication controlled by the hegemonic power. For instance, if we have an international north south transportation corridor, Russia, Iran, India, going to Russia all the way to Astrakhan, crossing the Caspian, and then down to the Persian Gulf, and then down to Mumbai. What do you
Last night I was talking about the north south transportation corridor and the fact that it bypassed the trade routes that were going through the Suez Canal, and around to Europe, around the Mediterranean into Europe, and the north-south transportation corridor, is an alternative trade route, and so Nima was raising the question of how important that was.
skip the Suez Canal, which is essentially controlled by the Americans, essentially. So this is a graphic example of how the whole pattern of international trade relations and commercial relations is being changed little by little. And that later on will lead us towards the possibility of the adoption of the Petro Yuan mid-term to long term. The fact that one of the key reasons to bring Saudi Arabia to the BRICS table is to have Russia, China, Iran, India discussing with Saudi Arabia, okay, let's try to establish a different pattern of commercial trade relations. And sooner or later, you're going to have to say bye-bye to the US dollar. And MBS, he's not a fool. He may be a very complicated character. He's not a fool. He understands the stakes.
So, as you can see, this new pattern of diplomatic relations, that's being established, is being established at least in part. One element of the new relationships. is to replace trade by using the dollar with trade that is more acceptable to the BRICS nations.
So this is how the whole thing, the whole chessboard is being changed real in real time, all the time, especially driven by these two main actors. The beginning of our conversation, how you started our conversation. It's all about what Russia and China do together, deliberate together. Then they try to.
Russia and China are driving the changes to the chessboard. Again, the metaphor of the chessboard and the idea of Russia and China checkmating, okay, the United States.
Explain to their top partners everywhere. They're going to be discussing this tomorrow in Astana at the SCO meeting, the Foreign Relations meeting. They're going to be discussing next month in Moscow at the BRICS ministerial meeting, which is going to be extremely important for the roadmap towards the summit in Kazan in October, and even for 2025 ahead. So when you see this strength and depth of planning, of long-term planning, little by little, step by step. It's extremely complicated in every dossier, but they had already started and they're doing it. And the partners are eager to be part of it, to contribute, to come up with new ideas, etc. The Africans, every time the Africans come to Moscow, they are in awe because they will look, well, we are establishing something different together and you are helping us. With the Chinese, is the same thing. And for over a decade, almost 2 decades, China investing in over 30, 35, at least 34 or 35 different African nations. Same thing. And will soon happen in some projects in Latin America, which are not part officially of Belt and Road, of New Silk Roads, but they are happening. By the end of this year, there will be the inauguration of a new port in Peru, which will be we can call it a Southern Silk Road port, because it will involve exports from Brazil going to Peru and from other places in Latin America. And from this port, they go all the way to Shanghai. And guess what? The main administrator of the port is Chinese. So, when you put this all together, it's fantastic. It's like you're watching a 3D 4K game of Go in front of you in a screen the size of the planet. And that's what makes it so exciting to all of us. And of course, we know with all the dangers in between.
In your opinion, with this new administration of Putin, we know that he put an economist as the head of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, and Shoigu was promoted to his new position. But when it comes to pulling an economist as the head, how do you see what's the importance of this move on the part of Putin and why he's doing this, in your opinion?
It's brilliant. It's an absolutely brilliant strategic move, because it shows that the Russian Ministry of Defense and the way Russia is a semi-militarized society, because they are in the middle of a hot war against the whole West. You cannot get more hot war than that. You have a hot war on your western border against the whole collective West against you, throwing everything against you. And they will continue to throw more Wunderwaffen months after months, and money and whatever months.
The Wunderwaffen are the wonder weapons, of course, in German, the Wunderwaffen.
After months after months. You need a semi-militarized economy, and you need it run by an economist. It's as simple as it gets. Shoigu is not an economist. Shoigu is not exactly a brilliant manager. Okay, many of you can disagree with me on that. It's okay, it's fine. But what we should all agree on is that when you have a top economist reorganizing the thrust of a semi-militarized economy that now has the most solid, the most competent military forces on the planet, with zero competition from anybody.
That's important, of course, to recognize that is, okay, a reality. The size of the Russian military today, at least in terms of ground forces, dwarfs the size of the U.S. military, okay, in ground forces. Now, of course, okay, the Russians don't have too much of a navy compared to the U.S. Navy. But when we're talking about the domination of the Eurasian sphere, or the Eurasian continent, the forces on the ground that have escalation dominance are the Russian forces, okay, and the Chinese forces. And the forces of the collective West can't really contest that. And that is now becoming a situation which is attracting many other nations to the institutions and the organizations that the Russians and Chinese have been setting up over a period of time that are an alternative to the Western institutions.
And when we get to the hypersonic domain, way ahead of anybody.
And that is so important. The United States never developed hypersonic missiles. There was a high level military decision made to focus, okay, on other things. We see today that that was a very serious error because this is an area where we cannot counter the hypersonic missiles, and they give the Russians a big strategic advantage over the United States.
So you need to streamline all that. You need a lot of cost benefits exercises. You identify sectors that you need that you know need more investment or more stream or even more streamlining, and nothing better than a top economist to do that. It makes perfect sense. Total sense. The Chinese understood that.
It's interesting. We don't have a top economist at the head of our Defense Department. We have, okay, military people at the top, okay, of our Defense Department. Uh, okay, it's a different concept. And that's why Pepe is saying that it was a brilliant choice, okay, by Putin.
Clearly. And I'm sure the Iranians also did. They did not express it in public, at least not yet, but I'm sure they understand what that means, and including in terms of the military collaboration between Russia and Iran.
Yeah. In Switzerland, we are having a new discussion, a new summit about Ukraine and what's going on in Ukraine. And Russia, they didn't invite Russia. Here in Brazil, Lula said he's not going to be there, and because Russia is not there. And the head of South Africa said the same thing. We still don't know if Chinese gonna send a representative to this summit or not. But it's unbelievable the ignorance on the part of the West and why they're doing this to Russia. And because so far they didn't benefit from this animosity toward Russia, but it seems that they're doubling down. How they can get any sort of outcome from this summit without Russia?
There will be no outcome, Nima. This is a PR operation. They may fool people who are already fooled inside what I call NATO stand, the whole space, North America to Western Europe and Eastern Europe. They can fool simpletons. They can fool people who get their information from, mainstream media. But these people are already lost in terms of being walking zombies. The people who really matter are people who make decisions. They are not fooled. The global South, the global majority, is not fooled. everybody knows that starting today, May 20, that thing in Kiev is an illegitimate government supported by nothing, legally, certainly illegally. They are in power because they decided that they will remain in power. And nothing, there's not a single piece of paper that supports that whole congregation of gangsters starting today, May 20. So what Medvedev already said in one of his posts, if I'm not mistaken, this morning is very, very funny. Okay, whoever is the bunch of gangsters who's over there, for us it's irrelevant, and it is. Uh, if there will be another bunch of gangsters next week or in 2 weeks, or if they throw Zelensky under the bus or not, from a Russian point of view, it doesn't matter. And it gets even worse for the West because something that didn't happen before. The system in Russia, the, the, the Security Council, President Putin, Lavrov as foreign minister, they tried everything. And now they finally lost their patience. They don't care. So the message now that, in fact, it's not a message. Now they are telling the West outright, look, we don't care that whatever you do, we don't care. If you want to discuss Ukraine, you have to be on our terms. The war in Ukraine ends when we say so. And the only thing that is left to discuss is the modality of rendition on the terrain, which will be not only the rendition of the bunch of gangsters in Kiev, but the whole of NATO. That's it. And this is the immovable high-speed rail train, let's put it this way, Russian. And there's nothing you can move this train. You cannot derail this train anymore. There will be serious attempts to provoke a really hardcore Russian response, or in their minds, the collective West, provoke some turmoil inside Russia. And I would say that the number one preoccupation for all of us is a possible attack on the Kerch Bridge this summer, which has already been announced, pre-announced. So there will be a serious attack against the Kerch Bridge between June and July. And what we heard from some of our very good sources that are extremely laconic in their wisdom, but sometimes with one or two words they say, oceans are contained in these words. The response, if Kiev and NATO and both try something against the Russian Federation, and especially against Kerch, is going to be the real thing, what many have been expecting for quite a while. And because this, it's beyond a red line for the bear. And the Russians have been saying it all the time. Look, think very carefully if you're attacking strategic targets, essentially civilian targets inside the Russian Federation. They are not listening. They're doubling down. So, okay, the response this time is going to be, I heard this weekend from a really, really good source. And so expect this will be the devastating response that, in fact, many people who are already also fed up, not only in Russia, but all across Eurasia, were demanding. And the provocation will come, that's for sure. It could be a false flag, it could be a direct attack with loads of Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles, maritime drones, you name it, using the new Wunderwaffen F-16s, you know, whatever the configuration. If there is such an attack, get ready. And then, of course, after that, all bets are off.
Yeah.
None of us can tell what could happen next, which could be something unimaginable.
90 seconds, okay, to midnight. So that's all for that particular video. Any big attacks against the strategic assets, okay, of Russia are likely to cause, an explosion. What will be the nature of that explosion? We'll learn more from the next video, which is an interview from Judge Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom, where the judge talks to Scott Ritter. And I want to go in here to about maybe 9 minutes in. 8 minutes and 30 seconds.
We can't save you from being tagged in a fail video, but we
Sorry about that.
Why do you think all the pressure was put on the United States to get that $60 billion package released from Congress when they did? One of the reasons is Europe was starting to play the blame game, starting to say, it's not us, it's them. And the Americans, Republicans and Democrats alike, looked around and said, we don't want to carry that. And so right now there's a contest between the United States and Europe on who's going to end up, holding the bag when this is all over. But certainly they know that this is lost money. But politicians have always spent money on losing causes if it helps them politically.
Tell me if this helps Emmanuel.
Sorry for this.
Macron politically. Cut number one, Chris.
So how do we explain to the Ukrainians that we're going to have to protect these towns and basically everything we're seeing right now around Rakiv if we tell them you're not allowed to reach the point where the missiles are fired from? The missiles, in fact, we're telling them we're giving you weapons, but you can't defend yourselves. So we stay exactly within the same framework. We think that we should enable them to neutralize the military sites from which the missiles are fired from, and basically the military sites from which Ukraine is attacked. But we must not allow them to hit other targets in Russia, obviously civilian capabilities or other military targets. When it's from identified targets in Russia that Ukraine is attacked, well, I think we have to be able to allow them to do that if we really want to retain our objective.
So he's saying, "I'm giving you long-range missiles. Go ahead and attack military targets in Russia." Professor Sachs reports that the Ukrainians have attacked and partially destroyed some very serious high-end radar warning systems in southern Russia.
So here comes the explanation of why it is so dangerous for the Western powers to allow the attacks that they're contemplating, right now.
Does the West not understand the legal and moral authority of President Putin to retaliate against Western sites when they do this and when they announce it?
First of all, we'll start with the two early warning sites. Those were attacked by Ukrainian drones, but it wasn't just Ukrainian drones that attacked them. It was Ukrainian drones married to American and NATO intelligence. These are drones that are pre-programmed. I mean, I think everybody has seen those fantastic shows where all the drones take off and then they go up in the air and then they turn on the lights and you get a walking man and then it turns into a whale and it turns into something. That's not something, somebody's not sitting there flying it. All those drones have been pre-programmed to fly that pattern. You can take a strike drone and do the same thing. When you get the intelligence about where the radar is, what the terrain masking is, you can have a drone pre-programmed to fly beneath the radar, masked by a hill, pop up here, come down here, come around here, and then show up at a place. Because everybody's going, why aren't the Russians shooting it down? I thought they had great air defense. Well, there's some things that you can defend against, like airplanes, missiles, cruise missiles. Some things you're not ready to defend against, like this new weapon system, this drone pre-programmed with the intelligence to evade radar. So the Ukrainians have done that and attacked these two early warning systems. I will say this, had those sites, these two early warning radars, been attacked by Scalp missiles, which is the French missile, or Storm Shadows, we would be in a completely different game. And this is why, and this is where Macron needs to really start putting in his thinking cap. You give the Ukrainians Scalp missiles, but he knows that the final technical details of the targeting is done by French technicians on the ground using intelligence from French satellites. He knows the Ukrainians play no role in this whatsoever. And we know this because the Germans, when they had their telephone call intercepted about the Taurus missile, admitted this was the case. They gave up the farm. It's all being done by the French. Now, they were talking about hitting the Kerch Bridge. They were talking about hitting sites in Crimea. And Russia has basically said, you know, we're not going to go to World War III over those kind of attacks. But if you start attacking inside Russia, it's not Ukraine doing this. It'll be an attack planned by France using French intelligence, using French resources. And Vladimir Putin has come out and said just the other day, he said, we know this. And the way he talked about it, he said it's space reconnaissance, satellites. If Macron gives the Ukrainians the green light to use French weapons programmed by French technicians using French intelligence to strike Russia, it's the same thing as France attacking Russia. And Russia has made it clear that it's going to treat it that way. And
so, 2 points there. The first point is there's a disagreement between Pepe Escobar and Scott Ritter concerning what the Russians will consider a serious attack on Russia. Scott does not think, that an attack on the Kerch Bridge would be considered serious enough to kick off a Russian retaliation against the Western powers themselves. But Pepe does. He considers that another attack on the Kerch Bridge will be taken very, very seriously by Russia. And the second point is that you see how Putin is looking at things. If there are French soldiers on the ground inside of Ukraine doing the programming of the drones and the missiles and using the NATO surveillance and intelligence to actually target the strategic assets of Russia, then that is France fighting Russia, even though the soldiers are not based, because the soldiers are not based in France, because they're based in Ukraine. That is a situation where Ukraine's allies are fighting along with the Ukrainians side by side against the Russians in Ukraine. And Russia will then feel free to retaliate against France itself, because France will have been fighting against Russia directly, not simply supplying weapons, but operating those weapons, using those weapons to attack the Russian assets deep inside of Russia. And Putin and Russia have said they're not going to tolerate that they're going to go where the French live, in France, in order to retaliate. And Putin has made similar indications with respect to Britain, and with respect to Germany, and with respect to anybody who fights alongside the Ukrainians inside of Ukraine to help them make attacks deep inside of Russia involving strategic Russian assets.
And that's what Macron doesn't understand, is that Russia isn't bluffing. In this case, the French satellite will go goodbye, the French ground control station will go goodbye, and any target outside of Ukraine that was involved in this will go goodbye. And this is a very serious thing, Judge, because At that juncture, France will scream bloody murder. They won't acknowledge that this was a Russian retaliatory strike. They will claim that Russia has attacked it and seek Article 5 protection from NATO. And the moment NATO votes for Article 5, Russia will nuke everybody because they'll just assume it's now a general war and they're not going to wait. And so this is the stupidity of Macron. This is the danger of Macron, the danger of Schultz, the danger of Richie Sunak. This is the danger of Tony Blinken saying the same stupid thing. We're going to give them a green light. Don't they know that the Russians know that all of the intelligence that goes into these precise weapon systems aren't done by Ukraine? Ukraine lacks the technical capacity to program these weapons. All Ukraine does is launch them, but every other aspect of this weapon was done by other nations that, and here's the other thing too. Macron shows the map with Russia. He said, we must strike these, I have a very bad French accent, I won't even try, these sites up here. Doesn't he realize that in the Kremlin, there's a Russian general that says, you know, look at Poland, look at the Baltics, look at France, look at Germany, look at England, look at Romania, look at Italy. These are all places where the Ukrainians do things that would normally be subjected to strike. They were just in Belgium. Do they not know that when a Ukrainian pilot is being trained at a Belgian airfield on weapon systems that are designed to be used against the Russians, that is a legitimate target? And so if they start attacking Russia and say, well, Ukraine has a right to strike those targets, you're sort of saying that Russia now has a right to strike all of Europe. This is the stupidity of the West. We just don't comprehend how serious this game is and why we're playing, brain-teasing games at this stage in the conflict is beyond me. The time to have done this was at the beginning of the conflict when maybe you could have made a difference. But right now, Russia is so far ahead of everybody. They've lapped the field 15 times. There will be no catching up, and all you're doing is committing suicide.
Here.
So there's a very explicit explanation of why this is so dangerous, because supporting these kinds of strikes inside of Russia can easily lead to a chain reaction that's going to result in World War III, and specifically a nuclear exchange. Scott says very explicitly, Russia will not wait. If NATO activates Article 5, Russia won't wait. It's going to launch those hypersonic missiles, and it's going to launch them against all of the NATO participants who have been related to the attacks on Russia that we are now contemplating. That's why this is so dangerous. That's why NATO is eye to eye, eyeball to eyeball with Russia, right now. And that's why the situation is so dangerous. Because the NATO structure will operate in a rather blind fashion if somebody makes a mistake. Going further.
Here's President Putin saying exactly what you said. Now, this is part of a long press conference. It's just a 20-second clip, but it's the essence of what he said and what you just summarized. Cut number 4.
Representatives of NATO countries, especially in Europe, especially in small countries, they should be aware of what they are playing with before talking about striking Russian territory. In general, this constant escalation can lead to serious consequences.
Folks, just want to take a moment to ask for your support today. Not a single donation goes unnoticed.
He doesn't bluff, does he?
No, there's no bluffing Putin. He's the most responsible leader on the world stage today when it comes to avoidance of conflict escalation. We have crossed so many red lines over the course of the past 2+ years And Putin has come under a lot of political criticism inside Russia for allowing these red lines to be crossed, but he's kept his eye on the ball. The eye on the ball is, of course, victory in Ukraine. And one way that you deny yourself victory in Ukraine is to expand the conflict so that it's now not just a proxy war with Ukraine, but you are actually fighting NATO. That's what Ukraine wants. That's Ukraine's goal and objective right now, is to get NATO in this conflict. And Vladimir Putin has been masterful in avoiding that. But it's at some point in time, you reach that final line. And the final line is attacking Russia with these Western weapons. And I don't know what you heard, but I heard a guy basically saying, do so at your own risk, that you will pay a price. This is no longer subject of debate.
You mentioned earlier that it is well known and understood that the French offensive weaponry in Ukraine is being operated by French soldiers. Is the American offensive weaponry in Ukraine being operated by American soldiers?
There are certain aspects of the targeting to receive the intelligence and all that. First of all, we're not going to give the Ukrainians access to the satellite, the encrypted satellite downlink. So as classified information is brought down from overhead onto a ground station, Ukrainians won't have anything to do with that ground station because of the cryptology involved, etc. So there's Americans there. Now they turn this into a targeting package. That targeting package will then go to the Ukrainians in the form of however they input it. It'll be done automatic. But there might be a Ukrainian technician who does that final stage, the hands on the weapons. We might not have Americans there, but we might. Again, I'm not familiar with the classification and the sensitivity of the data from point A to point B on the missile. But I can guarantee you that the vast majority of it, Ukraine will not have a single eye, ear, hand, nothing. They won't know anything about it because it's extraordinarily sensitive information. So we have Americans on the ground doing that, which means that we are picking the targets. It means that we have sat down and said, this is what we want to hit, collect the intelligence, download the intelligence, turn it into a target to get to Ukrainians, and then they push the button. But it's not the Ukrainians attacking. It's the United States attacking. And again, President Putin is fully aware of this.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk more about Russia's strategic advantage and how the Eastern European countries want to go with a winner. And that's why they're looking toward Russia. But first, this.
You all know that I am a paid spokesman.
I expect you'll agree. Here's one of them.
No, and I would like to take this back to something's happened. He's made 3 visits abroad since.
That is a statement by Professor Doctorow.
His election or re-election. The first was to Beijing, the second was to Belarus, Minsk, and the third was to Tashkent, which is where he made the press conference that you've just shown. And I'd take it back a couple of weeks to his stay in Beijing. I think that his lengthy and very detailed discussions with Xi gave him additional confidence to proceed with the direct challenge to the United States-led NATO that we heard in his Tashkent meeting. Let's bear in mind that the United States, with Blinken, has made trips through Central Asia in the hopes of dislodging Kazakhstan, dislodging Uzbekistan. These are the largest, most populous and important Central Asian countries from the Russian orbit. The nature of the meeting that Putin had in 3 days, it was a day longer than was planned, in Tashkent, during which a number of very important commercial agreements were signed, including for the building of the first nuclear power station in Central Asia, a small one, but nonetheless, this type of warm greeting without any side glances to those who are giving the come hither note, like Mr. Blinken, tells you that Central Asian countries are behaving as normal countries would. They go with winners. And they have sensed that Russia is the winner in the war with Ukraine and NATO.
Vote now for Democrat Dan Helmer for Congress.
At the rockin' age of 77, I'm still a practicing doctor with a heavy workload.
This is very consistent with what you said at the outset of this interview, Scott, that Putin is the smartest guy of the bunch.
Well, he's not just the smartest guy. He leads a very capable nation, a nation that has healed itself for the past 25 years, a nation that has tremendous resources. One only needs to reflect back on a speech made by Margaret Thatcher back in the 1980s about how powerful Russia was. She claimed that, of course, the West wins because of the strength of democracy. But, the point is Russia is largely self-sufficient in its natural resources. It can export tremendous amount of energy resources, a sustainable flow of income. And it has a leadership that has been stable for a quarter of a century, and it's built institutions that are likewise stable and capable. People don't understand Russia, but once you do understand Russia, you are immediately struck by the competency of the people who occupy every position of government. Extraordinarily competent. Judge, next week is the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And what the participants at this forum are going to see is that Russia is the center of the world during this time. This is the most influential economic forum in the world, more influential than Davos. They will have a more diverse group of people. National leaders from around the world are showing up because they don't just want to hang around winners and be on the winning side. They themselves want to succeed. And St. Petersburg is the stepping stone for an even greater event that's taking place in October, which is the BRICS Summit. And you're starting to see, Bahrain, Thailand, Serbia, other nations are starting to gravitate towards there because they realize that the option that they've been given by the collective West, by the United States, it's not a viable option. Russia and China together are a combination that is unbeatable at this point in time.
Who's
Okay, so that's enough of that. I commend the rest of this this episode of Judging Freedom to you. But the important thing to note here is that the warning from Putin was not a bluff. It was, a warning. And that the Western powers, the collective West, is playing with fire. Why is it playing with fire? It's playing with fire because the world is gravitating towards the Russia-China combinations and the institutions they have set up, also gravitating towards the business they're doing, and also gravitating towards them because of the coming victory inside, of Ukraine. I've been talking about this for months, and months now, talking about the likely impact of the war inside, of Ukraine. And we're seeing that impact, as we go forward. So it's 9:14 now. I have to get over to D's. I do want to look at your comments, so I will be doing that. And there is only one comment. Thank you, Geraldine Schaumburg, for coming. Don't know why attendance was so light here tonight. It could be because I made the title so short, but I did have a description that was longer and pretty descriptive of what I was going to cover. So I don't understand it. But anyway, the attendance was light and there's only one comment. So thank you, Geraldine, for being here, if you're still here now. But as for the rest, there are no more comments. So I will say good night and I will go over to D's.